Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to BRICAM Environmental Series Climate Change Focus, the road to COP26, meeting corporate climate commitments and the role of forest restoration projects. I am Asti, Events Coordinator at BRICAM Indonesia. This BRICAM webinar series is proudly supported by Scottish Development International, BP Indonesia, and Premier Oil. Today, we are delighted to welcome our three panelists, Jeffrey Chatelier, Managing Director at Forest Carbon, Lucy Arndt, Sales and Business Development Manager at Ecosphere Plus, and last but not least, Adam Gibbon, Investment Director at Mirova Natural Capital. Today's session will be moderated by Rino Donoseputro, Vice Chairman for ASEAN and President Commissioner at Standard Chartered Indonesia, and also board member of BRICAM Indonesia. And before we start, allow me to review the functionality of this Zoom webinar. Please be informed that today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be able to share a link with you when it's available after this webinar is completed. All dial-in participants will be muted to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to this webinar, and also to enable our panelists to present without interruption. And if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at any time. It is at the bottom center of your screen. And we will have time for Q&A session at the end to answer your questions. Okay, now without further ado, I'm going to hand the screen over to Anne Sleeman, Chairman of BRICAM Indonesia, to open today's webinar and also to launch the BRICAM Climate Change Focus Group.
Welcome everyone to this special BRICAM Environmental Series, The Road to COP26. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our two sponsors, BP and Premier Oil, as well as our partner, Scottish Development International. Next year, the UN hosts two important climate change conferences, one in Italy, focused on the world's youth, and then the main event in Glasgow in the UK, which will be attended by the world's leaders. At the last UN Climate Change Conference, the world's leaders agreed to set emission targets that would contribute to no more than a 2-degree temperature rise globally. Subsequently, many stakeholders have revised the target to 1.5-degree maximum rise. In order to achieve such a revised target, 2020 needs to be the year of peak emissions across the globe. This places enormous pressure on countries like Indonesia, and indeed Indonesia has often been criticized for its rate of progress. However, there are many great initiatives taking place in Indonesia, and as such, it is BRICAM's intention to bring them to our members' attention. It is my belief that by focusing on the positives, we stand a far greater chance of inspiring others to follow suit. Climate change can also be good for business, with an estimated $13.5 trillion in growth opportunities by 2030. However, we all need to work together, and in this regard, it is my pleasure to launch the Climate Change Focus Group at BRICAM. This focus group will be open to all members to participate in, and it's my hope that it will be led and driven by the membership. I also hope that it will become a catalyst for collaboration between our members and our Indonesian partners. If you would like to participate, I would very much like to hear from you. You don't have to be an expert. All we ask is interest and passion for the cause. To kickstart this series, it is BRICAM's pleasure to highlight one such project that is a strong Indonesia and UK collaboration content. It is also my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Rino Donoseputro, or Pak Doni, as he is better known to millions of Indonesians. Pak Doni is currently the Vice Chairman ASEAN and Present Commissioner of Standard Chartered Bank. He is also one of our board members. He's got a very long and extensive CV, but I'll just highlight a couple of areas of interest. He once ran Standard Chartered in the Falklands, and I believe he has represented his country at basketball. There's one thing I know for sure, Pak Doni has a passion for this cause. So Pak Doni, over to you to introduce our panelists. Today's subject matter, and lead us through the discussion. Hope everyone enjoys it, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ainsley, for your kind words and a very interesting insight into my CV. A very good morning, a very good afternoon, all participants, and welcome to the special BridgeM Indonesia Environmental Webinar Series. I'm delighted to be your moderator today. I see that we have about, it's really growing, over 75 participants joining us from actually all corners of the world, so very encouraging indeed. Just to set the context further, as Ainsley mentioned, climate change is moving into the forefront of global agenda as one of the most pressing issues facing the global community today. And we see around the world that companies and sovereigns alike are looking to measure and reduce their emissions with the goal of being either net zero or carbon neutral. You hear a lot of those expressions. Countries in particular are also putting together their strategic plans to meet the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs, to reduce CO2 emissions as part of the Paris Agreement in 2016. Now, coming into our topic today, forest carbon projects have been considered as one of the primary climate change mitigation options. And carbon credit has re-emerged as the main conduit in connecting global business and capital markets with the actual projects that reduce CO2 emissions. Financial sectors and investors are now also increasingly keen in playing their role in this new low carbon economy through the pursuit of their sustainable finance agenda. And that includes also my institution. So now BridgeM Indonesia would like to welcome our three distinguished panel speakers who will share their subject matter perspectives on this very interesting topic. And without further ado, let me make a quick introduction on them. So our first speaker for today is Jeffrey Chatelier. Jeffrey is Managing Director of Forest Carbon, an environmental consultancy focused on the Southeast Asian market, with a long track record in overseeing implementation of hundreds of projects actually across the region, working both with the public and private sectors. Jeffrey, by background, is a conservation scientist, and he has advised major corporations, multilateral institutions, international environmental organizations on conservation finance, forestry, and sustainability for over a decade. He's also a published author, having written a number of scientific books on sustainability and the forest carbon cycle. For the next panel speaker, you probably have seen in the flyer earlier, but it is unfortunate that Lisa Walker could not join us today due to last-minute unforeseen circumstances. But Lucy Arndt has kindly agreed to take her place. Lucy is the Sales and Business Development Director at Ecosphere Plus, a UK-based carbon credit venture whose mission is to scale up demand for natural climate assets, such as tropical forests and sustainably produced commodities. Lucy has extensive experience in addressing sustainability and climate change strategy, including in BG Group, which is an oil and gas working group. She holds a master's in sustainable development from University of St. Andrews, and she joins Ecosphere Plus after working in Kenya for a forest carbon red project. Last but certainly not least is Adam Gibbon. Adam is an investment director of Birova, a UK-based asset management firm with a strong focus on natural capital investments. So with Birova, Adam specializes in raising debt and equity investment funds that finance sustainable enterprises. Adam has an extensive experience in sustainable agriculture and voluntary carbon market standards, with previous roles in PwC, Rainforest Alliance. And he has also contributed to the development of numerous sustainable and carbon standards, and designed and developed a number of projects focused on sustainable commodity production and creation of economic value from ecosystem services that are maintained or improved. Shortly, I will invite speakers to share their perspective on the topic with us, and I will open the floor for the Q&A afterwards. Now, participants, you can use the Q&A box to post your questions. Now, let us turn to our first speaker, Jeffrey. Perhaps you can share with us an overview on this growing trend of companies pursuing sustainable agenda, the carbon credit itself, and of course, your experience in managing the actual projects in the country. Over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Pakdani. I think climate change is now becoming visible to people as we see more extreme weather events such as droughts and hurricanes that were once less frequent. As we know, climate change is caused by the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which occur when we burn fossil fuels, where forests, on the other hand, capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And globally, if forests are protected and restored, can contribute over 1/3 of the climate solutions needed to meet the Paris Agreement by 2030. I'm here today to talk about how a new wave of corporate climate commitments are creating demand for forest restoration projects here in Indonesia, but also throughout the globe. These projects can turn commitments into results on the ground by creating climate benefits and helping strengthen rural economies here in Indonesia and other tropical countries. Corporate commitments to sustainability and climate are becoming the norm. Markets are demanding real action, and companies are following through on ambitious commitments to mitigate climate change. This graphic shows a fourfold increase in public climate commitments from Fortune 500 companies in the past 5 years. Lucy from Ecosphere Plus will go into detail on how each sector is responding, but there are 3 concrete examples I'd like to touch on. First, the UK-based EasyJet was the first major airline in the world to commit to 100% carbon neutrality, and was followed soon after by Qantas, JetBlue, and also Delta. Microsoft pledged to be carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon negative by 2050, meaning they plan to account for all emissions from their operations since the company was founded in 1975. Shell, within the oil sector, has tied executive compensation to climate performance as part of its carbon neutrality plan. By 2050, it will offset what it can't cut. And this has been translated into a commitment to invest $300 million in forest projects over the next 3 years. Now, while only 23% of the Fortune 500 companies have major public commitments on climate, there is a clear trend, and we expect this trajectory to continue until the majority have climate commitments and reporting. When people ask why companies are doing this, the answer is simple. The markets are demanding it. As you can see from this graphic, consumers expect corporate entities to take action on climate change and also sustainability. But the pressures are not only consumer-driven. Financial institutions, governments, and industry organizations are also joining in to create market-based deterrence of deforestation. This applies particularly around no deforestation commitments within the commodity production sectors. For example, Wilmar, the largest palm oil trader in the world, has begun to enforce its no deforestation commitments with its suppliers. These trends are leading to investment and demand for carbon offsets from forest restoration and conservation projects. Once companies make commitments on climate and sustainability, they need to take action. In Indonesia, each dry season, the country's peatlands are at risk of burning. Last year, over 1.6 million hectares burned, causing $5.2 billion in losses and caused a public health crisis. In 2015, the economic impacts were over 3 times this amount, according to the World Bank, representing 1.9% of Indonesia's GDP, a staggering amount. The peatlands in Indonesia are at high risk of burning due to draining from man-made canals and use timber extraction. However, the risk of fire can be reduced through hydrological management and building peat compaction dams, and there is a proven business model to finance this restoration work. I will now talk about Forest Carbon's work on the ground as part of the new restoration economy. Indonesia already has an emerging restoration sector that manages over 250,000 hectares of forest that is certified under the verified carbon standard. These certified projects are creating millions of CO2 emission reductions on an annual basis and are selling their credits to major corporate buyers. These restoration projects are delivering benefits for ecosystems and rural economies. Forest Carbon, with our partner Global Alam Lestari, have developed the SUMATRA MERANG peatland project, which is restoring 23,000 hectares of degraded land with an investment of 5.1 million euros from the Althelia Climate Fund, which is managed by Morova Natural Capital, who's represented here today by Adam Gibbon. Since completing our certification in 2019, we have secured sales contracts with major global brands. The map that you see shows the fire hotspots near our project area in 2019. Our project area is located directly in the center of the slide by the red boundary. And as you can see, our project was successful in preventing fires through hydrology management and rapid fire response teams, which shows that our model can work when the entire landscape outside of our protection was under major threat of fire. Our project prevents an average of 1.3 million tons of CO2 emissions a year. That is the equivalent of the CO2 emissions from approximately 280,000 cars off the road for 1 year. With weather experts predicting a long dry season in 2020, we are expanding our fire response capacity and have trained community members on firefighting, and we're also working with neighboring plantations on fire prevention and control. In order to greatly reduce the risk of fire within our peatland ecosystem, we must increase the water table, as the project area has an existing network of man-made canals that are draining the wetland. These canals need to be dammed in order to restore the peatland and bring the water tables back to their normal levels to allow the forest to regrow. And as you can see in the picture here, we've used excavators to build what we call peat compaction dams. And a number of hydrology experts believe that this is the most effective way of restoring a peatland area. But in order to know the effectiveness of our project, we need to collect data on the water table. And so we're using new technology that leverages ultrasound sensors to measure where the water table is at any given time. And our technology is linked to an Internet of Things system and also a dashboard that gives us real-time data on the water table, rain levels, and also hotspots in the region, allowing for improved management of the peatland forest area. Beyond hydrology management, we are supporting the natural processes to bring back the forest cover and plant thousands of trees on an annual basis. The Sumatra MERANG peatland project is an important ecological corridor with the Sembilang Burbak National Park and is home to more than 20 endangered and vulnerable species, including the Sumatran tiger. We have a team of trained wildlife experts that study the area on a daily basis, with data showing a rapid return of the wildlife since we began our project in 2016. As required by our certification standard and also the fund that is investing in our project has a robust community investment plan. Our primary goal is to create local employment opportunities, and as of today, we have hired 55 people from the surrounding area. We also make communities into education in the local communities, and in working with the local communities, we identified a need for investments into the local schools. And since we started our project, we are supporting local teachers to obtain university degrees through scholarships, creating after-school programs for elementary students. And we also have continuing adult education for people looking to acquire a high school degree. And we're also making improvements to school infrastructure. Finally, our project is also investing in multiple initiatives to improve the local healthcare. We launched an anti-stunting program for new mothers and infants, and have hired local healthcare workers, and have also renovated healthcare facilities in the nearby villages. And I'd like to end the presentation with a picture that shows what is possible with peatland restoration. In 2005, the Sabangau National Park in central Kalimantan began peatland restoration activities. And you can see just how devastated the landscape was at that time. But once they started managing the hydrology, building dams to prevent water from being drained, you can see in the picture on the right, 12 years later, you can see a regrown forest. And I think this really shows what is possible. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. That's pretty insightful. And we'll come back to you during the Q&A, but let us now hear insights from someone who's at the heart of the carbon credit market itself. So Lucy, grateful if you can share your perspective on the dynamics of investments into forest carbon, including the role of carbon pricing in all of this. So the floor is yours, Lucy.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you very much for having me here today. So yeah, today I'll be talking about corporate climate commitments and the role of forest restoration. So to start off with, I'm just going to speak very briefly about who Ecosphere Plus is and where we sit in all of this. So Ecosphere Plus is a mission-driven B Corp. We're based in the UK, and our mission is to work with companies to create and implement nature-based solutions to climate change. We're part of the impact investment Althelia Climate Fund, which is now managed by Morova, and the final speaker, Adam, will tell you much more about that. So we as Ecosphere Plus have successfully marketed the carbon asset portfolio from the Althelia Climate Fund. And based on issued credits, we had a share of more than a quarter of the VCS market last year, and over a third of the forestry related market last year in 2019. And as Jeff said, forests and wider natural climate solutions are an essential part of the answer to climate change, and can provide more than a third of the reductions that are required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So they're a really critical aspect to be looking at. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide due to time, but I just want to emphasize that our approach is focused on using carbon pricing and the carbon market to accelerate action on climate change and ensure there is a value placed on forests. So we partner with companies across multiple sectors. We help them to develop new and innovative climate neutral or climate positive products and services. We help companies to take action in their supply chain or to manage climate risk within investment portfolios, and also use new digital technologies like blockchain to bring carbon pricing to the retail sector, for example, through microtransactions at the point of sale. So key pillar underpinning everything that we do is our approach to ESG, which is environmental social governance. And all the projects that we represent are developed and operated in line with best practice and best in class ESG standards. And they're all also double verified under two international standards. First of all, the Verified Carbon Standard, or the VCS, and then additionally the CCB, or the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard, which looks at all of the wider co-benefits of these types of projects. So just to touch briefly on, on those co-benefits really. So carbon credits don't only deliver carbon reductions on the ground, they deliver many additional co-benefits. So with a forest, for example, yes, the trees are storing carbon, but they're also doing much more for biodiversity and for local communities. And here you can see a list of our 7 impact themes that are applied to all of the Althelia Climate Fund projects. So they're listed on the side there: climate, ecosystems, species, livelihoods, inclusiveness, sustainable enterprises, and fair economic return. And we make sure that these are also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see here. And this is just showing that there are really wide benefits beyond climate for ecosystems and communities. So in terms of how companies can use carbon credits, so by integrating carbon credits into their transition strategies, for example, towards net zero, companies can report reductions aligned to the expectations of rapid decarbonization alongside reductions internally on operational and scope 3 or product emissions. So this is also very cost effective. Forest conservation alone can provide up to 2 gigatons of permanent reductions at under $10 a ton per ton of CO2. And this is the equivalent to taking over 600 million cars off the road. So this makes it a really compelling case financially for companies. So this graph, no problem. But that graph was just showing how companies can use carbon credits as this transition strategy to pair alongside internal emissions reductions with an external offsite emission strategy. So here I'll just go briefly into the fact that there has been really huge acceleration in corporate climate action, as Jeff was talking about, where there are many companies making specific commitments to incorporate carbon credits from natural climate solutions within their climate change or net zero strategies. Jeff mentioned some really good examples. Just to pick back up on the Shell example, in the UK, if you drive a petrol or a diesel car and fill up at a Shell petrol station, your fuel will be carbon neutral through one of their programs. And if you fly with EasyJet, based on Jeff's example, your flight would be carbon neutral through their program. So more widely across the whole aviation sector, that industry is beginning to enter into a carbon market that covers liabilities under the CORSIA system. So they have both voluntary approaches to to using carbon credits, but CORSIA is more of a regulatory approach. There are also some leading companies emerging that have committed to nature regeneration and restoration specifically. So L'Oreal is an example of a company that's done this, who've recently launched Purpose, but others have done similar, including Unilever. So demand could grow even further with action in other sectors emerging. So new commitments to carbon neutral or climate positive investment portfolios have been emerging, and they are often using nature-based carbon credits as this transitional solution that I talked about. In addition, many sports organizations are committing to carbon neutrality and engaging customers and fans on a very large scale. And in addition, the shipping sector, may be taking a much more sectoral approach and developing a sectoral mechanism similar to CORSIA, which has been done for aviation. So, so here I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the data that we're seeing come through across the carbon market. Which is showing this acceleration in corporate climate action that I've just been talking about. So the voluntary carbon market continues to grow very rapidly. And in 2019, it was a record year for issuances, with the issuance of the 100th million VCU overall, having occurred closer to the end of the year, which is a big milestone to have reached. What is also clear is that there is a really big increase in carbon credits called VCUs originating from AFLU, which stands for Agriculture, Forestry, and Other Land Use. So that's this natural climate solutions sector that we're talking about. So ever since 2016, issuances from forestry and land use related projects have outpaced issuances from non-AFLU projects. And this difference is growing over time. So AFLU issuances represented 72% of total issuances in 2019, as opposed to 38% in 2016. And the supply from renewables projects is being constricted over time. And at the moment, it's restricted to small scale and or least developed countries only going forward. So renewable share of this overall percentage will continue to decrease. So just to talk quickly about Indonesia's role in the natural climate solutions carbon market. Indonesia is one of the leading countries for VCS natural climate solutions issuances. You can see they are the yellow in the graph on the screen. And this represents issuances of VCS over time. So Indonesia is a major growth market for corporates, for example, in the beauty and personal care market domestically. There's also really high confidence in projects and in governance. There's also a high profile of the issues of deforestation and forest fires, as Jeff was talking about, which is really compelling a lot of people to take action, combined with the ability to demonstrate multiple co-benefits, and in particular for biodiversity, which Jeff went into on the example of the project that we're partnered on. So another way to make the link to Indonesia specifically is through the landscape that corporates source a lot of their products and ingredients from. There are many companies pursuing what's called the activity of insetting. So it's sort of come from the phrase offsetting. But as you can imagine, insetting is an opportunity for businesses to link GHG emissions reductions and carbon sequestration within their supply chain and to their sourcing landscapes. So this creates meaningful climate action that develops a sustainable land use model by protecting and valuing nature, and also results in socioeconomic benefits throughout the company's value chain. So to sort of wrap up, we were asked to say a few words about the road ahead to COP26. So the new rule book for the Paris Agreement is not yet agreed between countries, and negotiations continue on this under the UNFCCC process. And Article 6 specifically within this deals with the international cooperation through carbon markets and is a really vital link for the future of the carbon market. So here I'm just going to really quickly run through a couple of the crunch issues on Article 6.4, which will be negotiated at COP26 in Glasgow, which, as everybody knows, has been postponed to November 2021. So the conversation, we still are kind of waiting for some of those conversations to happen. But some of the key issues that need to be discussed there include the technical question of how to account for trade between countries with different types of NDCs and what's called corresponding adjustments to international carbon trading. So whether reductions are included within an NDC or additional to it, and how to ensure there is no double counting or double claiming. So a host country counting or claiming, and also a corporate, for example. Banking, so another issue is banking of Kyoto era carbon credits that many countries have a stock of. Another topic to be discussed is the share of proceeds to governments. So under the CDM mechanism, previously a portion of each carbon price went to the host government of a project, and in future this could be used to fund adaptation, for example. And then there's also some suggestions for the OGME concept, an approach to ensure that any tradable carbon reductions represent what's called an overall global mitigation effort. So that's it for me today. I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion, and of course, very happy to follow up with anybody after the session with further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Very comprehensive overview. And again, we will hear more from you during the Q&A. Finally, let's hear the perspective from the investor side. So Adam, Mirova seems to be behind quite a number of these activities as mentioned by both Jeff and Lucy. So can you share with us exactly the investor's view, as well as is there really a significant pickup from the investor side, and what makes Mirova is focusing on this area? Over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, and thank you to BritCham for hosting us today. Yeah, I'd be delighted to talk you through a bit about our organization, Mirova Natural Capital, the role of natural capital as we see it, and also impact investing, which is what we do. The Earth's natural resources are under pressure, and if we keep drawing down on our stocks of natural capital without allowing or encouraging nature to recover, we run the risk of global ecosystem collapse. It's worth letting those words sink in for a minute, because this is what the scientists are telling us: global ecosystem collapse. So this is not going to lead to the sort of economic shock we've seen with COVID or from the dot-com bubble, for example. But this is about the collapse of the underlying ecosystem on which all our agricultural supply chains, economic models, and arguably civilization itself is built on. So why are we facing this risk? Well, the stats show that by 2030, our global population will have increased by around 1.2 billion people. And with that, the demand for food will have increased by 35%, water 40%, and energy 50%. Already today, 2 billion hectares of land around the world are degraded, and every year we're degrading 12 million more. At today's levels of greenhouse gas emissions, we only have 5 years left before we surpass the budget that the scientists tell us we have to keep us under a 1.5 degree rise from pre-industrial times and the worst impacts of climate change. And already our activities lead to 20 trillion being lost every year in terms of ecosystem services that are being provided for the biodiversity. So this led us to, this is because of a number of global challenges we face: deforestation, soil degradation, biodiversity loss, air pollution, marine pollution, climate change, etc. And already day to day, these are having impacts on our life in terms of food and health security, natural catastrophes, poverty, migrations, etc. So there really is a big impetus to address this natural capital issue and get ourselves back on track. Thank you. So we believe it's time now to align the Earth's economy with its ecology, to rethink our global financial system and re-engineer it in a way that it can operate in harmony with ecosystems and drive local orientated growth solutions based on resilience, autonomy, and carbon neutrality. So we already heard from Lucy around the role of carbon neutrality and a drive from corporations, governments, and people to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible and offset where that's not possible yet today. We know in the marketplace there's growing demand for more traceability on where products are coming from and certification that those are meeting environmental and sustainability standards. And then we also see the macro trend now, unfortunately, in this post-COVID world of economic recovery programs getting underway by governments. What we believe is that these give an opportunity to invest and direct our efforts towards not towards unsustainable activities and unhealthy relationships like nature, which make us more with nature, that make us more vulnerable to things like pandemics, but channel that money into things like sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry and fisheries, and climate change adaptation programs that will actually bring the economy up, get jobs back, but also reduce the risk of things like pandemics in the future. So let's have a look at the scale of the financing challenge that we have ahead of us. So it's estimated that to adequately conserve nature and biodiversity, we need globally to be investing around 300 to 400 billion every year. Today, we spend around 52 billion on that challenge. 42 of that comes from public, so government and private donations, and 10 billion comes from private investment. Now, if we're generous and assume that we'll all dig a little deeper in our pockets, and so will our governments, and that those type of donations will double, that still leaves a $200 to $300 billion gap annually in terms of investments needed. And that slack has to be picked up by the private sector. And as an interesting footnote, it's interesting that the money that has been spent today on climate change mitigation has disproportionately gone to countries with low deforestation rates, whereas from what we've heard, we should be expecting, given the good value for money in conserving and restoring forests, more money to be flowing there. So $200 to $300 billion may sound quite a daunting amount of money. But what if I told you that that is only around 1% of what high net worth individual, retail, and institutional investors invest each year? So we only have to change 1% of investment patterns to make up this financing gap. So it's interesting. When I attend conferences related to financing and banking, I'll be told there's loads of money around, but the problem is there's no good projects to invest in. And then when I go to conservation and business conferences, I get told there's loads of good ideas, but there's no money to invest. So what's going wrong here? Why aren't large volumes of private capital reaching high impact investments for natural capital at scale? And I think that's because they're perhaps not quite aligned on three main issues. So one is risk. The risk of investing in these types of activities is perceived as too high. Scale. Often the people with the largest pots of money find the types of investment sizes, $500,000, 1 million, 5 million, 10 million. These ticket sizes too small to be of interest of the really large investors. And then also access. These investments are found, in the peat swamps of Sumatra and the Andes of Peru and the plains of Kenya. So getting access to these deals is difficult if you're sat in a shiny glass tower in London or Frankfurt or Paris or New York. So this is where we come in. My company, Untitled Capital, we are impact fund managers, and we've created a platform to do that. So our role is to educate investors on the types of opportunities that that exist and in the real risk and the real value which is out there. We design and manage investment vehicles to gather up different types of capital so that it's ready to deploy. We then find, screen and manage investment like we did into both Ecosphere Plus and the SUMATRA MERANG peatland project. We also, to tackle this risk issue, blend public and private money. Public money often more interested in the positive impacts, but willing to take more financial risk, whereas the private money obviously has a very keen eye on the financial risks that can be offset by the public. And we also look to other innovations, to provide guarantees, to look for innovative forms of collateral, to find financing flexible mechanisms outside the traditional mechanisms we see in banking today. Thank you. So to quickly run you through how we do this. So if we start on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have our investors, our high net worth individuals, retail banks, institutional investments, and that money goes into vehicles. And this is what we manage. We then make investments, typically private equity and private debt. Most of our funds have ticket sizes of around 1 to 10 million, tenors of sort of 5 to 10 years, reasonably patient. That money goes into companies like Jeff's, small to medium enterprise, but could also be larger companies, cooperatives, NGOs, communities or indigenous peoples groups. They carry out activities like degraded land restoration in the case of Jeff's, sustainable forest management, sustainable intensification of production, etc., generating revenue streams like certified crops, payment for environmental service credits, or ecotourism or fuel revenues, and generate the impacts, whilst their revenues go back to paying the financing and making a return for our investors. So to give you one quick example, in 2013, the first fund we launched was the Althelia Climate Fund. We brought together 10 public and private investors, including people like the insurance company AXA, Bank Credit Suisse, Dutch Development Bank, FMO, and the European Investment Bank. We made 101 million euros worth of investments across 14 different investments in 8 countries into NGOs, SMEs, cooperatives, government, and indigenous communities. Those sustainable enterprises gave us revenue streams from carbon, agroforestry, silver pastoral systems, cattle ranching, cooking fuel, and forest management, and helped to bring a return to investors. And in terms of impact, we have 2.1 million hectares under improved management for conservation, 102 threatened species protected, and tens of millions of tons of emissions reductions to mitigate climate change. Thank you. So off the back of the Althelia Climate Fund, we've launched another 5 vehicles, one focused on sustainable oceans, one on land degradation, one focused on the Brazilian Amazon, one that the Agri3 Fund that supports commercial lending in the agricultural agricultural space get more green, and then also one private mandate for a private company who's interested in climate and biodiversity investments. So when you add all these up, we have approaching $500 million assets under management, and are looking to grow that further. Our parent company, Mirova, has around 13 billion euros worth of assets under management. And our ambition now is with your help to keep growing this. So we look forward to continuing this journey with many of you. If you have either money to invest, ideas or investment opportunities to contribute, then we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Adam, and all the 3 panelists. I think given the time, let's just go straight to the Q&A. And now we're opening the floor to the Q&A, and please do submit your questions on the Q&A box. We got a number of questions already coming in, including the ones submitted earlier. Perhaps actually the first question, I'm combining here actually from a question from Florian of Starling Resources and the Biodiversity Consultancy. Essentially, how do these approaches that you talked about relate to the Science-Based Target Initiative and the Indonesia's own NDCs? And what do you think is the biggest challenge today for upscaling this natural climate solutions in Indonesia? Perhaps, Jeff, you would like to take a first stab at that?
Thanks for the question. I'll start out with science-based targets and the initiative around that. Essentially, companies that are buying carbon credits from projects like ours, they break their carbon emissions into 3 different scopes. Scope 1 is from direct emissions from activities that are under their control. You have scope 2, which are emissions from purchased or acquired energy like electricity. And then you also have scope 3, which are indirect emissions from the users of projects or emissions created within the company's supply chain. And so a number of companies that are buying our credits are focusing on offsetting their scope 3 emissions. And so that's one way in which our projects link with that initiative. Now, if we're looking at the NDC, that's the National Determined Contribution for Climate Change Mitigation of a country. And Indonesia has, pretty ambitious target to reduce its emissions. And one of the largest sources of emissions here in the country is from fires within peatland ecosystems. So by protecting and preventing fire in these areas, Indonesia can, greatly move forward on reducing its overall CO2 emissions profile. And also within the government, they have targets on peatland restoration of up to 2.6 million hectares. And so again, these types of projects align with the government policies and targets. And the other question linked to that was, how can we scale up natural climate solutions in Indonesia? I do want to say that, there already is a significant scale of projects operating here in the country. There are 4 projects that are certified under the verified carbon standard, totaling roughly 250,000 hectares. But there's tens of other projects that have specific licenses from the government for forest restoration that, total close to half a million hectares under conservation management. So I think, the government is getting behind the sector to promote it. You have new regulations coming online that will give more clarity on how these projects can integrate into Indonesia's overall targets for climate mitigation.
Thank you, Jeff. I think there's a follow-up question that relates to that with regards to Indonesia or similar countries with significant potential on natural capital. So we have a question from James Bryson, perhaps for Jeff, for you or Lucy. We've seen the news this week that the Indonesian Environment and Forestry Minister said that the carbon trading regulations will be progressed to the ministry level for further review. Now, how do you see the domestic system overlapping or working rather with the international sort of framework and mechanism? And what do you think governments, not just Indonesia, but in emerging markets, should do to accelerate financing of these climate change related projects in their countries?
Sure, I can answer that question. For many years, we've been expecting some type of domestic carbon trading system within Indonesia. There's been a number of regulations already on the books that essentially signal that, a more robust system will come into place. Now, currently, we're operating in what we call the voluntary carbon market. So these are companies that have, commitments on climate change and sustainability. Now, a domestic trading system would actually create a compliance system where companies are forced to participate. And so this essentially would create, greater demand for the forest restoration economy. And so, we see this as a positive development. It's something that President Joko Widodo's administration has been signaling to be part of and to build out over the next 5 years.
You want to add anything to that, Lucy, from your perspective?
Sure. I mean, thanks, Jeff, for providing the perspective on Indonesia, because I'm not an expert on Indonesia. But, you know, as he said, what I was talking about was the voluntary carbon market primarily. But we have seen that over the years start to merge in some cases with more regulatory markets like CORSIA, which is the aviation regulatory mechanism. And I think that that's something that companies in Indonesia could sort of keep an eye on, is that companies can use the voluntary market as a way to familiarize themselves with how to participate in a regulatory market. You know, what are carbon credits? How do you buy them? What types of projects are out there? What kind of quality standards should you look for? So yeah, that's kind of how those two markets can sort of start to blend over time.
Maybe from another angle, Lucy, have you seen anywhere in the globally a country that, you know, can be a role model in terms of setting the framework, regulatory or otherwise, to promote investments into these projects?
Great question. I mean, I think that the way that countries are dealing with this internationally are very different. So Colombia in the last few years released a regulatory scheme, which is effectively a tax that it has been very interesting for generating demand for local projects. So that's interesting. And then there are other countries that they're doing great work in terms of supporting, you know, integrating projects into NDCs, which is kind of a different angle. So, you know, Peru has taken a lot of steps on that. Adam, I'm sure, could give you more information in terms of what Morova has done to kind of facilitate that. But basically, in terms of what I kind of touched on is this issue of double counting. You know, once we get into a more unified system, how do we make sure that we're accounting for emissions reductions that are, you know, being used by NDCs or being used by companies, etc.
Very well, thank you, Lucy. So now let us turn to another question, quite interesting. And perhaps, Adam, you can pick this up. It's coming from Neil Carmichael from the British Chambers of Commerce in Myanmar. It's relating to the funding of COP26 that link forest projects, and seeing around the world, what are other countries where green bond type of structures are being used? You can share some thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So green bonds globally have been exploding. There's interesting statistics on how many the significant increase in green bonds year on year. When you get into the detail, how green they are relative to the type of activities we're talking about here may be questionable in some cases, but I think that's a positive thing. When you look at the universe of green bond issuance, only 3% falls into the sustainable land use category. So that's a very small amount. It is $37 billion, so it's not nothing, but it's a small amount. And of that, none is in agriculture. And most of it is in more sort of paper and packaging. Very little actually on the you know, on land use restoration, on sustainable forestry. And I think the obvious follow-on question is why? And I think it comes back to the graphic I showed of the gap between the two markets. So bond issuers need a very steady and predictable flow, cash flows to raise their bonds on the back of. And unfortunately, the dispersed, pioneering NASCA nature of a lot of these markets means it's not necessarily they're not all ready yet for green bonds. But we hope to see, you know, in the evolution of companies like Forest Carbon and industries like peatland restoration in Indonesia, that these can prove themselves, prove reliable regular cash flows, and then be candidates for bonds and start to change some of those numbers.
And just to add to you, I know for a fact that the Indonesian government has just recently issued a successful $2.5 billion of green sukuk in the global markets. So indeed, to your point, I think that's the appetite is very strong there indeed. Now, Adam, and perhaps to other panelists as well, I mean, there's an interesting follow-up question to this. So from Biodiversity Consultancy, again, I think, can you tell us the average expectations of financial returns? We're getting to the crunch of it, of your investments from the type of activities that you are involved in. Is it in a range of 10 to 15%? I mean, or perhaps actually how different it is within normal or conventional non-climate change specific investments that the financial markets are doing?
Yeah, I think what I should say is that generally our funds tend to try and our investments tend to be aligned with market expectations. So for the level of risk we're taking in you know an investment, we map that to similar investments. If it was forest carbon in Indonesia, for example, it might be to palm oil or forestry. That's the type of risk we're taking with perhaps a bit more immature market, and we're aiming for market returns. And we do that because to get the flows of money at the scales we need, we have to be demonstrating good risk-adjusted returns for our investors. Now, we're also aware that those returns can be difficult to achieve or possible, but high risk. And that's the reason why we use some of those blended financing mechanisms that I talked. So that could be layering public money into fund structures so that they carry more of the risk in terms of the risk return profile, and perhaps less of the return. And then also at the project level, we sometimes look for support as well. Can we leverage public sector money to help get companies through particularly risky phases in their development, and make sure they are ready for real commercial capital? But our objective is to prove this can be done. We can align our economy with ecology and still get the types of return investments that the investors expect.
Very well. So in that respect, with regards to the blended finance, I mean, Jeff, there's a follow-up question as well coming through the box here. Whether the financing structure of that MERANG project that you talked about, is it fully financed by Mirova, or is there a blended finance structure in place?
Yeah, the Sumatra MERANG peatland project actually was a blended finance project prior to Mirova Natural Capital coming in as the primary investor. We were able to link up with an Indonesian foundation called the Belantara Foundation, and they were able to provide some grant financing in the very early stage so we could launch activities in the field. And as part of that helped de-risk the investment, which allowed Mirova Natural Capital to come in and become the main investor in the project.
Okay, fair enough. Now, there's a specific question perhaps from Mila Wihatini, which is coming from the oil and gas sector. So as part of the many oil and gas companies' commitment to reduce their carbon emission, they develop the CCS or CCUS projects to meet their commitment. And in the next COP26, would there be any specific discussion related to this, i.e. CCS and CCUS, development, including its carbon credit valuation to support meeting the Paris Agreement? Jeff,
So,
Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely familiar with this type of question, but CCS, carbon capture and storage, is definitely one of the mitigation strategies of oil and gas. But beyond that, I can't really comment on it.
I think the follow-up question is that whether the standardization for the carbon credit units is pretty established as a commodity. Obviously, people know gold or other types of commodities, more tangible commodities are more well established. But to what extent actually has the development of the carbon credit as a commodity in terms of standardization?
We are seeing the markets get behind a few standards for carbon credits. One that our projects use is the Verified Carbon Standard. Lucy was talking about the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is creating a sector-based compliance system for offsetting. Now they've gone and have created a list of pre-approved standards which would create carbon credits. And so you are seeing a bit of standardization happening within the voluntary markets. Lucy, do you have anything to add on that, or maybe Adam?
I think that's a good answer. I have to admit, I'm also not an expert on the specific question in terms of CCS in the Paris Agreement, but I'd be happy to look it up and provide information afterwards.
Very well, thank you, Lucy. So let's move on to another question. We got quite a number of questions coming in here. So I think this is quite a strategic question coming from Tim Patterson. So the biggest challenge to achieving net zero is the transformation of the 9 of the top 10 coal-based economies to at least cleaner gas or gasification-based economies over the next 10 to 20 years. However, all the corporates want profitability from green bond investments only. Now, can the panel please give their view on how we deal with the necessary, albeit perhaps actually yet expensive cost of mitigation of GHG's production right now and the bridge between the brown and the green economy? So I think actually it also actually about some transformational sort of conduit, if you will, from the black and brown into the green.
I could start here. I should just say, you know, unfortunately, I don't have any experience in energy production or the costs of transformation in that sector. But what I do know about the science is that, you know, the global greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors around 25 to 20% of the global problem that we have. So, absolutely, you know, the biggest part of the focus has to be on, for our global efforts on climate change, has to be decarbonizing our energy supply. But we don't think doing that alone, because of the costs involved and because of the inertia in those sectors, is not enough. And even if we did that, if we failed to address the emissions in the land use sector, it will have been in vain in any way. So, and Lucy, I think, explained this in her slides, but we see the type of work we're doing as very much a wedge. So the solutions that we're proposing now are not that they can be profitable, and they're not expensive on a per ton basis. So there's no reason not to do that. Unfortunately, I'd have to let people in the energy sector come up with the solutions on the expensive challenges there, because that's just not my field of expertise, unfortunately.
It's a big undertaking indeed, and I know actually a lot of people in the oil and gas sectors are looking into this. Speaking of which, I'm going to, in the remaining time, I'm going to open up the floor for some live questions. And we can start with our main sponsors.
We have Rian Amri from BP.
Very well. Go on, Rian.
Oh, hi. Hi. Hello.
Hello. Do you have any questions for the panelists, Rian?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Noni and Adam, Jeffrey, and Lucy. It's very insightful, and it's unfortunate actually to hear that since I'm in the oil and gas company, that there is not much of knowledge that I can get in the development for the carbon market development for our sector in this session. But then I'm also curious on how's the carbon market development is actually progressing in Indonesia. I mean, how real is it going to happen, the ETS system? Is there been a discussion other than what has been conveyed before there is some progress in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry? Because I think the one that also has some stake to progress this is in the Ministry of Finance. Is there any progress from their side or their view on how the development of carbon market is in Indonesia? Thank you.
You may want to take this one, Jeff.
Sure. You know, I think Indonesia's made, you know, quite a bit of progress in terms of preparing for a carbon trading system. As I was mentioning before, the Ministry of Forestry and Environment has already created, you know, very specific license types that allow forestry companies to restore forest areas and also trade carbon. So you already have an existing policy infrastructure in place that helps promote these types of projects. You've also had recently the development of a climate change fund that's being jointly operated by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Forestry and Environment, which will help attract public sector financing into the country for the development of projects like this. And, you know, right now, the 4 certified projects in Indonesia that are operating, they're producing, you know, over 10 million emission reductions per year. And I know some of the projects are selling their credits within the oil and gas sector. I also know that, you know, British Petroleum, BP has their target neutral program, where they're also looking to make investments through the purchase of carbon credits into forest restoration projects. So I think there's a lot of activity taking place. And, you know, as one of the other comments said, you know, the minister has announced that there will be more regulations coming out soon on carbon trading. So I think we'll see good things to come in the near future.
And I can just add to that, because Standard Chartered is part of a consortium, and last week we had a joint meeting with the 2 coordinating ministers, Pak Luhut and Pak Erlangga, on the initiative to accelerate the legislation for the carbon trading market regulations for Indonesia, as well as to explore the first ever carbon credit-backed bond. So I think it is taking traction indeed, as Jeff mentioned. So thank you, Pak Rian, for your questions. I think we have reached the end of our session. And I would first like to thank all the panel speakers. This has been a very insightful sharing and discussion. And to all the participants, I wouldn't intend to summarize our conversations, but I think we can all agree a few key points here. One, that climate change is a clear and present global issue, and it is a top priority to many government and private sectors around the world. Secondly, we see that there are real efforts and real activities happening around the globe and in the region and Indonesia. And collaborations are happening between companies, NGOs, governments in achieving the climate change goals, and with the financial and capital markets joining in, as you can see actually from Lucy and Adam. Now, we hope that the session today has brought some value in demystifying viabilities and benefits, both socially as well as commercially, on forest carbon projects. Thank you everyone for joining. And now Ainsley, as the chairman of BridgeCham Indonesia, will say the closing remarks. Thank you, and over to you, Ainsley.
Thank you very much, Donny. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you very much, Adam. And thank you very much, Lucy. I thought that was an absolutely excellent start to our environmental series, The Road to COP26. I also see we've had a lot of responses to interest in participating in our climate change focus group, and there'll be a lot more content coming. I would just like to highlight one event we've got coming up, and it's related to something Jeff mentioned. He said there was an increased commitment from global corporates to head towards carbon neutrality. I'm very pleased to announce that one of the global corporates that are spearheading this challenge is Unilever, and we will be hosting the global CEO of Unilever, Alan Jope, on the 27th of July. He will also be joined by his Chief Procurement Officer, David Ingram. This is really one of the first for BridgeCham to have people of that caliber participating, or that global profile participating in this event. We're high caliber people here today. So I do look forward to you all joining us for that event, and I look forward to our new focus group participants posing the questions to both Alan and David. Once again, thank you very much, and best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.